Let's talk about the relationship of volume and intensity. Volume is essentially the amount of work we're doing. So weight times reps, right? Sets times reps. Also, you can times that by the weight you're using. That actually turns into work when you do it that way. But volume is essentially the work that we're doing, and it's basically how much. Intensity is how hard, right? There's a relationship between these two variables. And it is essentially that if one is high, the other has to be somewhat low, right? And this can depend on the specific time interval that we're looking at. Like in a given training session, this might be a high volume, relatively low intensity training session. This could also be like a macro cycle of training. It could be a sets and reps scheme, right? You're doing 5 sets of 2 reps. That's not a ton of volume per se. And so the intensity needs to be relatively high, right? So why managing volume and intensity matters is because essentially these are like the two biggest variables in any form of training, right? How much are we doing and how hard was it? The thing that a lot of us get bogged down in, or we really start to sabotage ourselves, is trying to do a high amount of volume at what is also somewhat relatively intense, right? And you see why this doesn't work. Like if I'm doing a high amount of volume, that puts me right here. But because the nature of these variables being like dependent on each other, like you're not actually going to be able to do a ton of intense work at a high volume. Or if you're trying to do relatively intense work, you're not going to actually be able to do a tremendous amount of volume of that intense work. Where people start to get into trouble is that they'll do something like this, but they'll like try to push up the volume, right? The tricky thing that happens is then stuff starts breaking down, right? You're trying to do too hard of work at too high a volume, right? Or they're trying to push the intensity with higher volume, right? And to some degree, like this is what the training process is over time, right? Is that as you get more capable, as you get fitter, as you get stronger, we are actually going to build our ability to do more work at higher intensity levels, right? Or we're going to be able to do like basically what I just said, more volume at slightly higher intensities, right? This means like somebody who's just struggling to run maybe 3 miles eventually can speed up that 3 miles, right? And the tricky part for a lot of us is like we try to do it in a short amount of time, and it doesn't actually bode well for us from a physiologic standpoint. We start to get into moans and groans. And even more insidious or just problematic is that we actually start to just live in this area right here where we're doing like a little bit of volume at a relatively challenging way, but like we're not actually getting better. We're not actually like building enough volume to drive adaptations in one direction or enough intensity to drive it in the other, right? There's a lot of ways to manage volume and intensity. There's so many different programs built around this. I mean, every program has to be built around it to some degree. If you're just throwing a bunch of volume and intensity at yourself, unless you're very gifted, you're going to start to break down. But really creating the structure of a training program that navigates these variables well is a key component in like keeping people healthy, helping people achieve results, and ultimately like helping people actually get what they want out of the training process. A lot of people start exercising and training and they just beat the crap out of themselves with a ton of volume and relative intensity. And what we want to do is actually kind of create waves of, okay, this is a little bit higher volume, then we're going to go into a little bit higher intensity, and we're going to go back and forth. You don't necessarily have to micromanage that. It kind of can sort itself out if you get the appropriate amount of stimulus, meaning just like overall work, in over and over again. This is where the general adaptation syndrome kind of comes into play, which is basically stress, recover, adapt, which that's always happening. there's also a tremendous amount of like benefit to practicing some things at higher volume, right? And then practicing things at higher intensity. And you can take kind of the practice model of training as like training is a form of practice for like either a sport or, you know, lifting weights. There's a skill acquisition component, and a certain amount of like specific skill is required to drive more general adaptations, you know, like when it comes to like lifting weights and stuff like that. But what we really want to conceptualize here is that if you try to like do too much work at too high of an intensity, bad things are going to happen. Over time, yes, your ability to do more work at higher intensities is going to happen as your fitness improves, right? But where people get stuck and where people break down is they're kind of always trying to do that. They're starting outside of their capacity and they're never actually allowing their body to adapt and grow and change. And that's one of the things we want to keep in mind if we actually want to get results in the gym. Appreciate you watching this. Remember, volume and intensity are huge components of our training. So be mindful of how much your work you're doing, how hard it is, and where you want to go. Because if you're doing a bunch of work and it's not taking you where you want to go, then we should adjust and change things up in a way that is actually getting you the results you want. Because being the hardest worker in the room that's not actually getting results doesn't really matter. Thanks so much for watching. You can follow me at dave.strengthandkindness on Instagram or subscribe to this YouTube channel here. Appreciate you.